Okay, so today we're going underground, into the world of bunkers.
Ooh, sounds intriguing.
Yeah, it is. It's a fascinating topic, actually. We tend to think of bunkers as, these Cold War relics.
Right, like something out of a spy movie.
Exactly. But the reality is they're much more than that. They've evolved in really interesting ways. Think luxury homes, off-grid communities, even potential energy solutions, and it's all happening underground.
Wow, I had no idea. It sounds like we've got a lot to unpack.
We do. We've got articles, forum discussions, company websites, a real mix of perspectives from survivalists to, well, folks just curious about DIY options.
So it's not all doom and gloom then?
Not at all. It's more about exploring human ingenuity and preparedness, I think, and understanding how these spaces reflect the anxieties and the aspirations of our time. What I find really interesting is this shift from bunkers as purely defensive structures to something more multifaceted.
Right, like they're becoming solutions for a wider range of concerns, not just nuclear war.
Exactly. It's like a mirror to society's fears, but also its ingenuity. But before we get too deep into the modern stuff, let's quickly touch on the historical context. The Cold War era, with its looming threat of nuclear war, really shaped the initial concept of bunkers, wouldn't you say?
Definitely think of it as duck and cover, taken to the extreme. The WBT radio bunker in Charlotte, North Carolina is a perfect example. It was part of this government network to ensure communication even after a nuclear attack.
I read about that. They had pre-recorded church services ready to broadcast.
Yeah, imagine that. Talk about planning for the apocalypse.
It's wild. Pre-recorded sermons amidst potential nuclear fallout. It's a stark reminder of those very specific anxieties of that time. But you're right, the threats we face today are much broader.
Exactly. Natural disasters, civil unrest, pandemics. These concerns are all influencing how modern bunkers are designed and used. We're not just prepping for one big catastrophic event anymore. It's more about mitigating a range of potential risks.
Okay, so the why behind bunkers is evolving, but what about the what? What are people actually building? We've got everything from DIY setups to these elaborate survival condos, right? What's the difference? And what's driving this diversity?
It really comes down to individual needs and resources, I think. On one end, you have people repurposing shipping containers drawn to their practicality and affordability. There's a whole Reddit community dedicated to finding the cheapest ways to create dry underground bunkers using these containers.
I was checking out that thread, and the DIY ingenuity is pretty impressive. But they also highlight the challenges, especially when it comes to waterproofing and ventilation. It's definitely not as simple as just burying a metal box.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
There are some serious safety considerations involved in any bunker construction. But then contrast that with the luxury end of the spectrum. We've got former missile silos being converted into these high-end living spaces.
All the bells and whistles.
Exactly. The one in Kansas that we read about boasts amenities like a pool, a theater, even a dog park.
A dog park. Underground. Wow.
Yeah.
Some people are preparing for the end of the world in style. But with a price tag of $1.5 million, it makes you wonder, is this really about survival? Or is it about maintaining a certain lifestyle, even in a crisis? It's a fascinating glimpse into the psychology of prepping, I think.
It really is.
Yeah.
You have people focused on bare bones functionality while others are prioritizing comfort and even luxury. It raises questions about what we value and what we're willing to sacrifice when it comes to safety and security.
It's like a microcosm of society itself playing out underground. Speaking of location, are all these bunkers in remote, isolated areas? Or are they popping up closer to home?
That's where it gets even more interesting. We're seeing a real diversification of bunker locations, reflecting different strategies and needs. For example, there's Vivo's X Point in South Dakota, built on a former Army base. It claims to be the world's largest survival bunker community, with capacity for over 5,000 people. It's essentially a subterranean town.
5,000 people. That's incredible. And what surprised me is that the price isn't astronomical. Comparatively speaking, $55,000 for a bunker, plus annual ground rent. It makes you think about the economics of survival. Is that considered affordable in the context of a potential global catastrophe?
It's a great question. It highlights how preparedness is often intertwined with privilege and access to resources. But it also challenges our assumptions about what constitutes a community in a crisis situation. Can you really foster a sense of shared responsibility and support in a pre-planned, commercially driven environment like that?
That's a fascinating sociological question. But you mentioned diversification, and that brings us to urban bunkers. It seems almost counterintuitive to seek refuge underground in a densely populated area.
Right, but think about existing infrastructure. Cities like Kyiv have used their subway systems as shelters during conflicts. And there's even been discussion about utilizing the New York City subway for similar purposes.
Using the subway as a bunker. That raises a whole host of questions about safety, accessibility, and logistics. I mean, were those subway systems designed with that kind of sheltering in mind?
That's a key point. Retrofitting existing spaces for bunker use presents unique challenges, and it highlights the importance of considering accessibility and inclusivity in any kind of emergency planning.
Absolutely. But before we get into the ethical and social considerations, let's shift gears and talk about something unexpected. Bunkers being used for purposes beyond just hunkering down. It seems these concrete fortresses are getting a modern makeover.
They are. We're seeing everything from former anti-aircraft bunkers being transformed into urban parks to proposals for turning them into holiday rentals. It's a fascinating blend of history and modern practicality.
A bunker Airbnb, I'd definitely book that. It's amazing to see these Cold War relics being repurposed in such creative ways. And it's not just about leisure, there's also potential for using bunkers to address some of our current energy challenges, right?
Exactly. Think about it. Those robust underground structures are perfect for storing energy. A study by the Technical University of Darmstadt explored converting former military bunkers into compressed air energy storage facilities.
Hold on, compressed air, how does that work exactly?
Well, imagine using excess electricity to pump air into the bunker, compressing it like a giant underground balloon. Then, when you need power, you release that compressed air, and it spins turbines to generate electricity. It's a fascinating example of how these Cold War relics could contribute to a more sustainable future.
It's like turning a symbol of potential destruction into a source of clean energy. That's pretty incredible. But with all this bunker building and repurposing, are there regulations and considerations that need to be addressed? It can't be a free-for-all, can it?
You're right, it's not a free-for-all. But the regulations surrounding bunker construction and use vary drastically depending on location. Organizations like OSHA in the U.S. provide guidelines for emergency action plans, but those are often focused on workplaces rather than private bunkers.
So there's a bit of a gray area when it comes to individual bunker ownership and use. That seems like it could get complicated, especially in a crisis situation.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity, and it raises important questions about who gets to decide how these spaces are used and who has access to them when it matters most.
But before we dive into those ethical and logistical questions, I want to shift our focus to the human element of bunker living.
Yeah, the human element. We've talked a lot about, the physical aspects of bunkers, where they are, what they look like, how they're built. But what about the people actually using these spaces? What are their motivations, their fears? How are they preparing themselves mentally and emotionally?
That's a crucial aspect that often gets overlooked in those, technical discussions about, air filtration and all that. But thankfully, the sources we've got actually provide some pretty fascinating insights into that human side of bunker living.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of insights are we talking about? Well, for one thing, there's a whole spectrum of approaches to prepping, even within that DIY bunker community. That Reddit thread we mentioned earlier about building a super dry underground bunker as cheaply as possible is a great example. You have folks who are hyper-focused on cost-effective solutions, repurposing everything from old water tanks to concrete sewer pipes.
Yeah, I can see the appeal of that. Not everyone has, a spare $1 million lying around for a luxury bunker.
Right. But what stood out to me in that thread was this one user who brought up a point I hadn't even considered. The psychological impact of being confined underground, potentially for a really long time. They were worried about claustrophobia, anxiety, and even potential conflicts rising from, being in such close quarters.
That's a valid concern for sure. It's easy to get caught up in the practicalities of survival food, water, shelter, but we can't underestimate the mental and emotional toll that a crisis situation can take on people. Did any of the sources offer strategies for coping with those psychological challenges?
Not directly, but the contrast between those minimalist DIY bunkers and the luxury survival condos offers some food for thought, don't you think? Those high-end bunkers with their theaters and gyms and even dog parks, they seem to be addressing more than just basic needs. It's like they're trying to create a sense of normalcy, a semblance of the life people are used to.
It's like they're trying to bunkerize the whole human experience, but it does raise an interesting question. In a long-term survival situation, how much psychological comfort do we actually need? Is it enough to have those basic needs met, or do we crave something more, like social interaction and entertainment?
It's a question philosophers have been grappling with for centuries, but in this context, it takes on a whole new urgency. And it really speaks to the importance of not just physical preparation, but mental and emotional resilience as well. We need to be prepared not just for the material challenges of a crisis, but for the psychological ones too.
It's not just about stockpiling supplies, it's about cultivating inner resources too. Makes sense. But let's get back to the practicalities for a moment. We've talked about ventilation and waterproofing, but what about those other essential aspects of bunker living, like water and waste management?
Right. Those are critical.
Yeah.
One company specializing in converting shipping containers into bunkers really emphasized the importance of having a robust drainage system to prevent flooding, which makes sense. They also recommended composting toilets as a sustainable waste management solution. Not exactly glamorous, but essential.
Composting toilets in a bunker. Okay, now that's an image I wasn't expecting. But it makes sense from a sustainability perspective, right? You can't exactly rely on traditional plumbing in an off-grid scenario.
Exactly. And it highlights that resourcefulness that's required for long-term bunker living. You have to be creative and adaptable, for sure.
So we're seeing this whole spectrum of approaches, from bare bones DIY to high-tech luxury. But what about the social dimension of bunker living? Are we talking strictly individual survival, or are there community-based approaches as well?
That's where things get really intriguing. We're seeing a growing interest in community bunkers, spaces that are designed to house not just individuals or families, but larger groups of people. Vivo's X-Point, with its capacity for over 5,000 residents, is a prime example of that.
A bunker for 5,000 people, that's more like a subterranean village. But can you really create a functional and resilient community in a space designed for survival? What happens to social dynamics when people are confined together under such extreme circumstances?
Those are questions that sociologists and psychologists are probably studying right now. It's a fascinating social experiment, really. You have to consider everything from leadership structures and conflict resolution mechanisms to, the psychological impact of shared trauma.
It's like a real-life version of those post-apocalyptic movies, but with hopefully a less dystopian outcome. But speaking of community, one of the sources mentioned the importance of accessibility and inclusivity in bunker design, especially when it comes to public shelters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In Kiev, where they've used the subway system as a shelter during conflicts, they've faced challenges ensuring equal access for people with disabilities, the elderly, and families with young children.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder that emergency preparedness needs to be inclusive. It can't just be about those who are physically able to, get to the bunker and navigate it.
Yeah, it's a matter of social justice, really. You can't just assume that everyone can scramble down a ladder or navigate a narrow passage in a crisis situation. Bunkers, or any type of shelter for that matter, need to be designed with everyone in mind.
I completely agree. And it highlights the need for proactive planning and thoughtful design from the outset. But shifting gears again, let's talk about the legal side of things. Are there regulations or permits required for building or owning a bunker?
That's a question I've been wondering about. It seems like something that would be heavily regulated, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, it's not as straightforward as you might think. Regulations vary a lot depending on where you are. In many places, building codes still apply to underground structures, even if they're intended as bunkers. So you have to think about things like structural integrity, fire safety, and proper ventilation.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want your bunker collapsing on you during an earthquake or turning into a giant oven because of poor ventilation.
Exactly. And in some cases, there might be zoning regulations that restrict what types of structures are allowed on a property. So it's essential to do your research and consult with local authorities before you start digging any giant holes in your backyard.
So it's not just about the practical challenges of building a bunker, it's about navigating the legal landscape as well. But what about the availability of public shelters? Are there any countries or cities that are particularly well prepared in that regard? Like, do they have enough public shelters for a large portion of their population?
That's an interesting question. We came across a Reddit thread where people were discussing the state of bomb shelters in European cities, and the responses were all over the place. It seems like there's a real lack of standardized information and preparedness across different countries.
So some countries are more prepared than others. That's not too surprising, I guess. Were there any specific examples mentioned in that discussion?
Yeah, one person from Finland claimed that their country has enough space to fit almost the whole population in bomb shelters, even referencing a Reuters article as support. Another person from Switzerland mentioned their building has a designated shelter in the basement, which they said is pretty common in older buildings that were constructed during the Cold War.
Wow, a whole country with enough shelter space for its population. That's impressive. But it sounds like other countries are lagging behind. What about places like the UK or Germany?
Well, someone from Northern Ireland mentioned that there are a few privately owned nuclear bunkers near them, but they're apparently abandoned and not in a livable state, to use their words. And a German user shared a link to an article claiming only 3% of the Austrian population would have access to a shelter in case of a nuclear attack.
That's a stark contrast for sure. It's a reminder that even in developed countries, preparedness levels can vary drastically. It makes you wonder what factors influence a country's approach to public sheltering.
Yeah, it's a complex issue for sure, with historical, political, and economic dimensions. But it also highlights the importance of individual responsibility, I think. If you're relying on public shelters, it's crucial to be aware of their availability, condition, and accessibility in your area. Don't just assume there will be one when you need it.
Absolutely. It's always better to be informed and have a plan rather than relying on assumptions or hoping for the best. But let's circle back to something you mentioned earlier. Those diverse and often unexpected ways bunkers are being repurposed in the modern world, turning something negative into something positive.
It's a fascinating trend. We've seen how bunkers can be transformed into everything from urban parks and energy storage facilities to even cultural spaces. Like we're finding new ways to reclaim these symbols of fear and anxiety and turn them into something positive and beneficial.
It's a testament to human ingenuity and adaptability, for sure. But before we delve deeper into those creative repurposing projects, I want to revisit the topic of accessibility and inclusion in bunker design. It's such an important consideration, and I think it deserves its own dedicated discussion.
Yeah, it's inspiring to see all these creative ways that people are repurposing bunkers. But ensuring accessibility and inclusivity in all bunker designs is crucial, especially when we're talking about public shelters. We can't forget about that aspect. You're absolutely right. It shouldn't be an afterthought. Accessibility needs to be baked into the design right from the start. And luckily, there are already established guidelines and standards we can learn from. For instance, OSHA in the U.S., they offer specific recommendations for ensuring accessibility for people with disabilities in their emergency action plans, which include, considerations for shelter-in-place situations.
Okay, so that makes sense. Could you give us some concrete examples of what those recommendations actually entail?
Sure. OSHA emphasizes clear communication and signage, especially for people with visual or hearing impairments. They also stress the need for accessible evacuation routes of shelter spaces, making sure they can accommodate wheelchairs, walkers, and other mobility aids.
So it's more than just, having a ramp or a wide doorway. It's about anticipating that full range of needs that people might have during an emergency and being prepared to meet those needs.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just physical accessibility, too. We also need to address the needs of individuals with cognitive or developmental disabilities who might require additional support or assistance during a crisis.
That's a really important point. We often think of accessibility just in terms of physical limitations, but it's so much broader than that. It's about creating an environment that is truly safe and supportive for everyone, regardless of their abilities.
I couldn't agree more. And this brings us back full circle to our discussion about the evolution of bunker design and purpose.
Right.
As we move away from that image of the isolated survivalist bunker and towards these more community-oriented approaches, the importance of accessibility and inclusion becomes even more critical.
So are you saying that the future of bunkers might be less about hunkering down in isolation and more about creating resilient and inclusive communities that can actually support each other in times of need, kind of rethinking what a bunker can be?
That's a very insightful observation.
Yeah.
And I think it's a future worth striving for. Bunkers, once symbols of fear and isolation, could actually become catalysts for building stronger, more connected, and more equitable societies.
That's a powerful thought. To think that these structures, born out of fear and uncertainty, might ultimately help us build a better future. It really speaks to the adaptability and resilience of humankind. But before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more fascinating aspect of bunkers we haven't really discussed yet: their potential as historical and cultural artifacts.
Oh, that's a great point. Many bunkers, especially those from the Cold War era, have become historical landmarks in a way, offering a glimpse into a period of, intense anxiety and global tension. Preserving these structures and sharing their stories can help us understand the past and maybe even learn some valuable lessons for the present.
Absolutely. And some bunkers, like that converted one in Hamburg, have been transformed into cultural spaces, hosting art exhibitions, concerts, and other events. It's a really powerful way to repurpose these spaces and foster dialogue about history, resilience, and the future.
I couldn't agree more. Bunkers, in all their various forms, offer a unique window into human history, ingenuity, and even our capacity for hope and adaptation.
Well said. So as we kind of emerge from this deep dive into the world of bunkers, what's the key takeaway you want our listeners to ponder?
I think the main thing to remember is that bunkers are more than just concrete and steel. They're reflections of our anxieties, our aspirations, and that enduring drive to survive and thrive, no matter what challenges we face. And as we've seen, they have the potential to be so much more than just shelters. They can be spaces for innovation, community building, and even cultural expression.
That's a fantastic summary. It definitely leaves us with plenty to think about. So to our listeners, we encourage you to continue this exploration. Think about what a bunker means to you, what role it might play in your life, and how it could contribute to a more resilient and inclusive future. And as always, we welcome your thoughts and questions.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and perhaps stay prepared.